Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley McManus, Senior Director of Global Marketing at SmartEye. Welcome to the Human-Centric AI podcast, where each episode we feature thought leaders doing cutting-edge work in the AI space. A little about us. SmartEye is the global leader in human insight AI, technology that understands, supports, and predicts human behavior in complex environments, bridging the gap between humans and machines for a safe and sustainable future. Affectiva, now a SmartEye company, has been a pioneering force in emotion AI for the last decade. Used by 26% of the Fortune Global 500 companies, 90% of the world's largest advertisers, and over 1,300 research organizations around the world, Affectiva truly stands at the forefront of decoding human emotions through technology, offering marketers and creatives an unparalleled understanding of audience engagement and feelings, shaping the future of compelling storytelling and impactful content creation. Today, we are joined by a guest whose journey traverses the dynamic realms of traditional media and cutting-edge technology. Dr. Leon Hawthorne is not only a former news anchor for CNN International and CNBC Europe, but also a founder and CEO of 2 satellite television channels. His extensive experience in the media landscape has been complemented by his entrepreneurial spirit, leading him to explore the forefront of artificial intelligence in digital communication. Dr. Hawthorne recently earned his Ph.D. in 2024, delving into the captivating world of generative AI and its impact in our digital lives. Long before the current surge in AI adoption, Leon embarked on a research project called Talking Heads. This initiative aimed to evaluate the integration of AI-generated virtual humans as on-screen news presenters, a concept that has gained unprecedented relevance in today's rapidly evolving technological landscape. His findings, which we'll be exploring in detail today, shed light on audience perceptions, preferences, and the challenges that arise when blending human authenticity with the great prowess of generative AI. Let's listen in to learn more. Okay. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. With me, I have Dr. Leon Hawthorne. Thank you so much for making the time to speak with me.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here again.
Yes. So for those who missed our 2022 episode, which I will link in the show notes for folks to listen to, can you share a brief overview of your doctoral research project, Talking Heads, and the motivation behind it?
Yes, well, it's called Talking Heads, the use of virtual human presenters for the delivery of news content. And I've just completed it just a month ago. I'm very happy to be a doctor now.
Yay!
Thank you. Well, it's all about the use of synthetic media or avatars that look like realistic humans that can be used as human-computer interfaces, i.e. they can be used instead of just chatting with a chatbot. You can actually have a conversation with something that looks like a human being, but is not a human being. So that's the idea about having these virtual presenters, these virtual humans, as news presenters to deliver content to consumers.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So it's fascinating to think that this research of yours began, over 2 years ago now, way before the boom of generative AI. So I was hoping you could take us back to the early stages. What inspired you to delve into this area of research before it became such a hot topic?
But actually, it started almost 4 years ago. My background is in news. I'm a former news anchor for CNN and for CNBC Europe. So that's what motivated me to look at this whole area of how news can still be relevant and how it can be delivered to audiences who are massively moving away from broadcast television as their primary source of news and moving more online and within online to social media. And I had done a master's research at the University of Birmingham that was specifically looking at how news broadcasters were reaching audiences aged 18 to 34 on digital and social media platforms. And then this PhD was an extension from that, trying to think, well, how can we utilize the technologies that aren't quite there yet, but are emerging, and use that to reach these audiences who are not sitting down in front of the TV at 7, 9, 10 o'clock, in the evening like we used to, 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah, definitely. So how did you go about selecting those four, kind of presenter models for evaluation? What were the criteria behind choosing? I think it was a real human, simple cartoon, cartoon caricature, and virtual human. How did you kind of arrive at those four?
Yeah, well, the central research question was to see how these virtual humans would affect engagement with the news content. Would they be accepted by the audiences?
Hmm.
And so, in order to do that, I devised four versions of a presenter. One was a real human, and I was the guinea pig for that. The second one was a virtual human, as best as I could with a limited budget, have a virtual human design that looked like me, but was obviously not me. And in between those two, I had a simple 2D cartoon, such as you might see on The Simpsons or any TV cartoon series, and using that as a presenter, and then a slightly more complex caricature 3D model cartoon. And that caricature had, outsized features like a large head, rounded cheeks. It was slightly more babyish than I'm sad that I'm not as baby faced as that version. So those were the four different models. They all looked more or less the same. They were of the same person, me.
Yeah.
They were wearing the same clothes. They were sitting in the same TV studio, and in all instances, they used the same real human voice, mine.
Mhm.
So those were the four different models that we use. And the idea for that came from some research I read about 10 or 15 years ago. I mean, it was written 10 or 15 years ago, notably one from some Japanese researchers, Seiyama and Nagayama. They were looking at the uncanniness and how people respond to different versions of a doll. And they used a real human child and a doll, various versions of a doll, which
Mm.
kind of morphed into being human. And so that was the idea of having these like a continuum between something that was obviously not real and something that was real, and trying to gauge what were the varying points along that continuum where people's reactions differed.
Yes, definitely. So let's talk about that. What were some of the key findings from, I think it was 16 short videos featuring these different models and the news stories that they read?
Yeah, so there were those four different model looks, and
Yep.
then I wrote four different types of news stories. So there was a very serious news story about killings in Sudan, through to a light-hearted story about people resembling their dogs. So the whole idea was to see not only does the appearance of the presenter possibly have an impact on engagement, but did the appearance matter when it was linked to what the substance of the story they were conveying was?
Mhm.
So you had four different models, each reading four different stories separately, individually. So there were
Mhm.
16 different videos.
Mhm.
And then I basically asked 100 news consumers what they thought of these 16 different videos. And I was measuring whether they thought the characters were engaging, whether they were knowledgeable, and whether they were trustworthy. And essentially, the feedback came, and the answer was that they much, much preferred the real human, which was
Mm.
very validating for me as a former news anchor, that they preferred me to any
A person.
animated or virtual version of me. Um, but the main problem that they had with the virtual human was that it was, in their mind's eye, uncanny. That was to say, it wasn't sufficiently realistic enough. It wasn't, in a way, they preferred the simple cartoon because they knew they were obviously looking at a cartoon.
Mm.
The
Okay.
thing about the virtual human is it was pretending to be a real human, but it wasn't convincing them. And
Mhm.
that's effectively the definition of uncanniness, that it falls in that gap of lacking ultimate persuasion. And at that point, the image starts to induce fear and scariness and revulsion.
Mm.
Um, and that's the problem. And so when you're designing these characters, you often have to use a concept called escape by design. That is, you purposely make it look less realistically human.
Mhm.
So you make it look slightly more cartoonish because people then are not fearful. They know they're not being conned into believing that this is a real person. Because when they think you're trying to persuade them it's a real person, then they expect it to be effectively 100% accurate.
Yeah.
Whereas if they know they're looking at something that is an avatar, a cartoon of some kind, then they kind of lower their defenses and they find it more acceptable.
Mhm. Okay. So yeah, and I'm interested for these 100 people, right? So were there any specific demographics or characteristics among these, I think it was 100 news consumers that influenced their preferences for the different presenter models?
Surprisingly, there was only a little bit of difference based on the demographic profile of the people. I mean, those that were younger were slightly more into it than those that were older. But the main differences were along psychographic lines. What do people think?
Okay.
And within that, it was those people who were less keen on new technology versus those that were more keen, and those that were heavy consumers of news versus those that were light consumers of news. It was those kinds of attitudes that were
Okay.
most important in determining whether or not they found the virtual humans to be convincing.
Mhm.
And also, what was the source of the news content or the virtual humans? What I found was that people who, when they were told that the virtual humans were potentially being provided by a technology company,
Mhm.
then they were very averse to the idea. Whereas if they were told that the virtual humans were being provided by a news company that they recognized, like the BBC or Sky News, then they were more willing to accept it. So it was those
Oh,
attitudinal issues rather than straightforward demographic issues that were most important.
okay. Interesting. All right. So I think a few years ago, you had used Affectiva's emotion AI to help you kind of conduct this research. So I'm curious how you would say that the, emotion AI response differs from the conventional, survey method. Like what kind of insights did it provide for you?
Well, what I found was that when people were asked what do they think of the videos, then obviously they had more time to consider the appearance of the presenter and the content, the substance of the content that they were consuming or that the
Mm.
presenters were conveying. Whereas what I found when I looked at the information on their facial emotions that was provided by Affectiva was that the single face model that had the highest impact was model 3, which is my cartoon caricature, which
Mhm.
was a baby-faced version of me,
Mhm.
almost a childlike version with a very big head and big eyes and rounded cheeks. And that seemed to evoke the highest level of emotional reaction as measured by the emotion AI software.
Interesting.
Whereas the very same one, when people were asked how did they respond to it when it was delivering news content, that actually gave the most negative responses. So, what that pointed out was that there's a difference between what Affectiva measures, which is valence and expressiveness, which is essentially instinctual responses to the videos and
Okay.
to the cartoon characters or the virtual human characters. Whereas what you measure through conventional means is what people think. So it's a difference between what people call system one and system two thinking. It's one is instinctual and one is more thoughtful and deliberative. And
Yeah.
when people, so even though an image has an instinctual appeal, such as big eyes, rounded cheeks, because it looks like a baby. And that's why I chose that image, because humans are programmed genetically to respond favorably to babies.
The babies. Yeah.
Um, But if you think about it, you don't want a baby telling you, what's the state of the world economy, or what's happening in the civil war in Africa. And so that's why when people thought about it, they didn't like the look of that character to deliver news, but it actually, they responded very highly to it in terms of their instinctual responses.
Got it. Got it. Okay. So the overwhelming preference for the real human presenter was clear. Um, what aspects of the virtual human design, maybe you already answered this, were identified as contributing to the negative emotions and the high levels of fear among the participants?
Well, overall, this notion of uncanniness, that it wasn't quite good enough. The
Mm,
design wasn't quite human looking enough. Now, you can do much better designs than that if you have the budget, and there are new technologies and
yeah.
new companies out there that can create virtual humans at relatively low cost that look more authentic. But still, within that uncanniness umbrella, the single biggest criteria was lip synchronization.
Mm,
If you're looking at a presenter and their lips don't match the words that they're speaking, that has a massively negative impact. I think the single biggest comment that people gave was the lips don't match the words. And they
okay.
found that particularly annoying
Mm,
and off putting. So it's not just the static look. If you're looking at a photograph, a still image, it's not just what does it look like, but it's movement. And it's the combination of movement, which includes your facial gesticulations, your facial expressions, and your lip synchronization. Everything combined has to work. Otherwise, it doesn't work.
yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, and this next question, I think you've answered some of it, but there's one piece I wanted to address. The Model 3, which was the 3D cartoon caricature, I believe, elicited high positivity and emotional engagement. But I was wondering, in your paper, could you elaborate on the concept of super normal stimuli and why it might have worked at an intuitive level and maybe not at a deliberative level? Let me know if that makes sense.
Well, supernormal stimuli is a term I found in the research from some researchers called Costa and Carrozza. And what that is talking about the size of the head, the size of the eyes, the size of the nose and the mouth, and so on.
Okay. Okay.
What they found in, I think, some research they did in 2006 was that larger and rounder eyes and higher and rounder lips and a reduction in the lower face roundness, those factors instinctually have a positive impact on whether people find the image to be engaging or attractive.
Oh,
And this broader issue about the size and shape of your different facial organs, it's called
yeah.
facial metrics, right? There, various scientists have found that the size and the shape of your forehead versus your chin versus the size of your nose versus the roundness of your eyes, these do have an impact across races and ethnicities, across nationalities, as to whether people find those faces attractive and whether they find them trustworthy and whether they find them authoritative. So technically, you could play about with the facial metrics of a virtual human so that you design a face that is specifically attractive or specifically thought to be trustworthy or intelligent to match individual consumers. It does vary slightly between men and women, and whether the presenter is male or female, but it
Okay.
doesn't seem to vary much across different ethnicities.
Got it. Okay. So, and to flip this a little bit, what would you say, the main concerns expressed by, senior executives from news media companies regarding the deployment of virtual humans as news presenters were?
Well, news executives hate the idea, especially those from broadcast television. I mean, the reactions were quite strong. I think primarily because they see a fake presenter as representing the embodiment of fake news. And if you can't trust the humanity of the person delivering you the news, then why should you trust the validity of the content that they are delivering?
Interesting.
So that was the main thing. And they also think that these images have the capacity to be used to deliver fake news as well. You can, for example, create a fake version of a well-known news anchor and get them to, give a fake bulletin and push that out on social media. And if you look at it without looking at it too detailed, then you might believe, yes, that is the real NBC Newsnight anchor or BBC or ITV anchor. So that's their main concern, that the one of trustworthiness in the content and the trustworthiness in their brand. Albeit, ironically, the consumers said that they trusted the news brands to deliver a virtual human, much more so than they trusted, a Google or a Facebook to do it. So there's a little bit of a gap there. That if we can persuade any of these news companies to do it, then there are a large number of consumers, especially those who don't consume news in the regular way, who are kind of open-minded to this. The other concern that they had was, I think whether this is a romantic idea or not, they do believe that news and journalism is all about human connection, and it's about human to human interaction. And they kind of look at this idea of having a computer or robot delivering you the news as another loss of humanity from the whole production and creative process. So they're quite reluctant, albeit despite their reluctance, virtually all of them thought it was inevitable.
Mm-hmm. So, in your opinion, what steps do you think can be taken to address, these different concerns and maybe facilitate the acceptance of virtual humans in news delivery?
Well, where the news producers and the news consumers seem to agree, even when these characters aren't perfect in their appearance as humans, is that they can be used to deliver certain types of news content. And those types were ones which are mainly numbers based, almost the unemotional transaction of giving consumers numbers. For example, financial market updates, sports scores, weather news, travel news, this type of rather functional information exchange where there's no emotional investment on the part of the consumers, no need to empathize with the presenter. Just give me the numbers, what's happened to my stock prices, what's happened, to the travel on the motorway, that kind of information. That's where these can be used. The other thing is that nobody is seriously suggesting that you're going to replace the anchor of the ABC or the BBC News with a virtual character on broadcast television. This is obviously something that's going to be used on web and social and mobile platforms. And the main purpose is to personalize the news for individual consumers. So instead of you going onto a news app and seeing the content that has been decided by a journalist news editor, that your virtual human presenter can sift the internet and find content that is specifically that is of interest to you and present it to you in a visual way rather than you having to do the work. So that use of personalization on mobile platforms, that's the primary purpose, I think, of this type of technology.
Yeah, that's really cool. So, and I think you probably covered a lot of this, but based on your research and the conversations with industry professionals, what are your final thoughts on the future trajectory of virtual humans in the news presentation?
Well, oddly enough, Jules Verne wrote a short story in 1889, more than 120, 30 years ago. It was about a fictional news man and the newspaper called the Earth Chronicle. And his vision was that there would be a virtual human who would deliver us the news and would present us the news. He wrote this in 1889. This was
Wow.
before television, before radio, before telegrams, before any of the technology that we use today. I think there are lessons to be learned from Jules Verne. And also, 100 years later, Nicholas Negroponte wrote about the Daily Me, which was his idea at the start of the internet age of how we would consume news instead of us getting news that wasn't all that relevant to us, but it was the general
Yeah.
news as decided by journalists deciding what is important and what is not important, that we would only get the news that was of importance to us. So it was a democratization of the news process.
Yeah.
Now, to some extent, that's what journalists don't like, because journalists like to be in control of the agenda, whereas this technology offers the opportunity for democratization of that news curation process. So I do believe that we will have virtual humans delivering us content. We're kind of almost there already with things like Siri and Alexa that we
Mhm.
can use to search for things. So it's just
Yeah.
about putting a face on Alexa and using it to deliver us content that is of use to us.
Nice. Excellent. So I have one last question for you. Considering the surge in generative AI adoption in the various industries, how do you feel that, your research from 2022 has become particularly relevant today? What are the aspects of the technology back then that hinted at the potential disruptions that we're witnessing now?
Well, my vision or the way I looked at virtual humans was merely that of a presenter, almost like a ventriloquist dummy, to speak the words that were written perhaps by a journalist. Whereas what we've obviously seen in ChatGPT is that those words don't need to be written by a journalist. They could be written by a large language model. So putting together the idea of a virtual human with these LLMs, these large language models like ChatGPT, it means that I foresee in a very short period of time, 5 or 10 years, that there will be large uses of these virtual presenters to speak to us, to deliver personalized content that has not been written by humans, that has been written by AI, and that can communicate with us in a user-friendly way. Instead of reading text from a chatbot, this thing can speak to us. And the appearance of that speaker, that face, that virtual human, the appearance will be specific to appeal to us. So if you want, for example, to speak to a virtual doctor to give you health information, then that doctor can be male, it could be female, it could be old, it could be young, it could be white or black, it could be whatever the appearance that is likely to be most impactful to you.
Yeah.
That's what it would look like. And that face could perhaps change in real time to match what your face is. So it's a kind of interactive process. And of
Oh,
course, the voice can change as well. So it has the right accent, as obviously the right language that is going to appeal to you. So I see the uses, although my interest was in news, I
yeah.
think news is perhaps less than 1% of the utility of this research. I think it's going to be used for customer service. It's virtual doctors, virtual teachers, virtual lawyers, virtual all kinds of things, virtual police officers, where we can use this technology to replace areas where there just aren't enough people, or indeed the
Yeah.
people don't do the job very well, and the computer could do it better.
Mhm. Absolutely. So fascinating, so interesting. That's all I had for you. So, Dr. Hawthorne, it was a pleasure speaking with you once again, and thank you so much for making the time to chat today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
It was such a pleasure speaking with Dr. Hawthorne again. It's fascinating to hear the results of his research, which showed that though audiences overwhelmingly prefer real human presenters, there exists a nuanced acceptance of AI generated virtual humans in specific contexts, shedding light on the delicate interplay between technological innovation, audience perceptions, and the future of digital communication. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe to the Human Centric AI podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you get your podcasts for new episodes. We are also on social media, so please reach out to us on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram to share any feedback you have on the show and weigh in on the discussion using hashtag Human-Centric AI Podcast. Don't forget to rate us and comment with your feedback to help make the podcast more discoverable for others. Until next time, thanks for listening.